Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Humanism Club in the Villages. I'm Bo Goldsmith. It's really great to be here with you today, here in the villages where the earmuffs and gloves come out when it sinks below 55 degrees. All right. Do we have any new people here today? Anyone who's not been at this meeting before? Welcome. Welcome. We typically have a speaker meeting on the first and third Sundays at this time, which consists of a speaker presentation followed by a question and answer session that's mediated by the host carrying a mic around. The second Tuesday of the month is what we call, Sunday of the month rather, is what we call Social Sunday, that is run by Pam. Pam, you want to give us a highlight on that?
Oh,
Hey, go up front and use the mic.
no,
No?
not today. Social Sunday, we're going to talk about, or watch a short video on how the younger generation has lost so much confidence in this country and the possible reason that home ownership is just out of reach for them. Their relative wages are very low, and they just don't have the opportunities that all previous generations enjoyed, of being able to be, say, at the age of 30, about as well off as their parents were.
Right, that will be next Sunday at this time, and on the 19th, we're going to have a guest speaker, an excellent speaker, Dr. Jose Gaudier is going to talk about the biology of love, and it will be, it's not X-rated, but it is R-rated. So keep that in mind for those of you who might be too sensitive to go over the subject. If you're new and you would like to be included on our notification list, email list for upcoming meetings, there's a board in the back that you can put your email address, name and email address on, and we'll be happy to put you on the list to get the weekly mailing with regard to the topic, and type. I want to thank Pam once again for both keeping me in line and providing the refreshments. Thank you. As well as running with an iron hand the Social Sunday meeting that will be next week. Eugene, thank you so much for your technical support and expertise. Appreciate that. And we have a couple of other announcements we want to make. And Jim Bucko is going to do that for us.
We just wanted to thank you so much for responding to the survey that we put out. We've got a lot of things to discuss on the board and inputs that we think are very, very useful. So thank you very much for that.
When did you send it out?
Sent it out in the weekly email that we sent out in our announcements. There was a link in there to that, and he also sent a separate email on that. I don't know if you can still respond. You can give it a shot.
Yep.
It should be still open.
Right. We're taking these results, from my point of view, all too seriously, especially some of the comments about me. As soon as we recover from the bruises engendered by your comments, we're going to have a board meeting and see how we can incorporate your suggestions into it. Yes, ma'am?
A number of us didn't see that survey.
If you were on the email list, I'm pretty certain you got it. Unless it's spammed over. I can't tell you. Because I know it went out to the entire list. Oh, this is a month ago, at least. Yeah. What do you remember the date, Jim?
No, I do not remember the date.
But it was
It was early December. right?
Yeah, it was early December that it went out.
The other announcement I wanted to make, I want to thank everybody that responded to the Marion County issue to their school board there. They were attempting to put chaplains into the schools in all of Marion County, and the response was quite significant to the negative to do that. So they voted it down, and so I want to thank everybody for their input on that issue.
All right, thank you very much.
December 16th, the survey went out. You know, and you're just on and on email.
Okay, how time flies when you're having fun. I thought it was a week early. Okay.
She didn't get the.
All right. Well, and our sister group, the Freethinkers, their next meeting will be at on the 9th at Bridgeport at 2:30. That's a p.m., a Thursday. And Mark Welton's going to talk about the rule of law principles and challenges. Yes?
That survey went out on December the 16th.
Yeah, I got it.
Oh, did they? I'm sorry. I was looking it up.
We'll explore.
That's all right. I need things repeated twice.
We can explore sending it out again.
What? Jim?
I said we could explore trying to send it again and see.
Yeah, if there's a significant number of people on the list that feel that didn't get it, I saw suspicion that this is something that could have gotten spam, you know. Because I know that it went out, it even went to me. All right. If you would be kind enough to mute, silence, or otherwise handle your cell phone, that would be a courtesy to the speaker and to the discussion. Today, I'm really happy that we have Jim Vukelic, who is a retired judge, so mind your P's and Q's, okay, as well as an educator. And he's going to talk to us about homeschooling, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think. Jim.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Mott is a very small town and the self-proclaimed capital, pheasant capital of North Dakota. I suspect that there are more of the game birds. I suspect there are more of the game birds there than there are people. The population of Mott, when I was growing up, was around 1,400 people. In the early 1980s, I was living in Mott and serving as the county prosecutor for Hettinger County, a county so sparsely populated that my job was part-time. But for a neophyte attorney, it gave me free office space in the Hettinger County Courthouse and a modest salary. Back then, North Dakota had a fairly strict truancy or compulsory attendance law. It required that all children between the ages of 7 and 16 be enrolled in a public or private school that employed teachers who were certified or licensed by the state. The county superintendent of schools was responsible for determining compliance with the truancy law. In the fall of 1981, the county superintendent of schools informed me that there were children living in our county who were not attending any school, public or private. Our sheriff did an investigation and determined that children from 4 separate families were attending a newly formed Christian school, the Living Word Academy, in the county next to ours. A young couple, married couple, who had just graduated from a Christian college in Texas, served as the entire staff for the Living Word Academy. Neither of them were trained as teachers. Neither of them were licensed to practice as a teacher in North Dakota. I sent a letter to the 4 sets of parents advising them of North Dakota's law and asking them if they would come to my office so that we might discuss any means by which they could avoid being charged with truancy. The 4 husbands dutifully responded to my letter and came to my office. They told me they were well aware of the law, but that as Christian parents, they believed that man's law had to give way to God's law. They knew that the teachers were not certified, but it didn't make a difference to them. They said they would rather go to trial than to compromise their religious beliefs. They asked a favor of me, though. They asked that I not charge their wives with an offense, because as Christian men, they were the head of the household, and they made the decision as to where the children should be educated. Perhaps I should not have done so, but I acquiesced in their request. Truancy was an infraction punishable by a maximum penalty of a $500 fine, less serious even than a misdemeanor. Nevertheless, the defendants came to trial, the 4 husbands, ready for battle. They were represented by the law firm of Gibbs and Craze out of Cleveland, Ohio, 1,300 miles away from mine. Gibbs and Craze specialized in what they called freedom of religion cases. Newspapers from around the state were covering this first of its kind prosecution of good Christian parents. As a young, naive prosecutor, I thought this case was a slam dunk. I would call the county superintendent of schools to testify about the names and ages of the children and the fact that they were not attending any public or private school in the county. The state would rest its case. Not so fast there, Jimmy boy. Not so fast. The defendants would not stipulate to what everybody knew, that they lived in Hettinger County. Unfortunately for me, that was one of the elements of the offense that I had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, you'd think that that would be easy enough. But I was forced to call somebody from the power company, somebody from the telephone company, and a UPS driver, all to testify that these people lived in Hettinger County. They fought every inch of the way until finally I threatened to subpoena the wives to testify about where they lived. At that point, they conceded that they lived in Hettinger County, and it was only a short time before the state rested its case. For the first time in decades, this little town had a courtroom that was filled to capacity for 4 days. I will guarantee you that there has never been, and probably will never be, another trial in North Dakota on an infraction that lasts 4 days. Every day at noon, the defendants and their supporters would cross the street to the Assembly of God Church, where I learned later they prayed for me. I need it. The audience included Mennonites and Hutterites, who are mostly in the eastern part of our state, Mott's in the southwestern corner, so they had to travel a couple hundred miles to come to the trial. Mennonites and Hutterites are Anabaptists like the Amish and have a similar lifestyle. So they were all in attendance watching this drama unfold. After the state rested, the defense launched a full-throated attack on the constitutionality of North Dakota's truancy law, alleging that it violated their religious rights, their right to freedom exercise of their religion, and on my decision to attempt to enforce the law. Testifying for the defense were the two teachers from Texas, an educational expert with a PhD from Kansas who came up to North Dakota for the trial, and Dr. Rusastan Rashtuni, a biblical scholar from California, flew up to North Dakota so that he could testify. I'll never forget. He was on the witness stand pointing at me and accusing me of being not a prosecutor, but a persecutor. And of all people testifying for the defense was the North Dakota State Superintendent of Public Instruction, the highest educational official in the state, a craven politician in my view. He had never visited the Living Word Academy, and he took the same oath that I did, which I cross-examined him about, an oath that said he would support and defend the Constitution of North Dakota as well as all of its state statutes. Well, those people who were across the street praying must have prayed for the judge too, because in the end, the Honorable Thomas L. Seacrest, who was a horse breeder from Texas and retained his drawl despite having lived in North Dakota for decades, in the end, Judge Seacrest found North Dakota's truancy law to be constitutional, and he found that the defendants had violated that law. So he imposed a penalty of a $15 fine, which to this day, none of the defendants have ever paid. Fast forward 5 years. I'm Chief Deputy in the North Dakota Attorney General's office. My boss was angling to run for governor. The last thing he wanted was to do battle with a very vocal and well-organized group of Christian parents who were lobbying the legislature to change the law that required teachers to be certified. They wanted to make it easier to start up schools like the Living Word Academy or the very then nascent homeschool movement. The Attorney General was getting flack from both sides. The public school community basically wanted no change in the law. The Catholic school representatives mostly stayed out of the fray. The Attorney General asked me to head up a committee to study the issue, and our task was to draft legislation to present to the next legislative session, laws that might accommodate the sincerely held religious beliefs of some parents while assuring that children were adequately educated and that children with disabilities were not just closeted at home. We met many times, but eventually we did come up with draft legislation which satisfied exactly no one on the committee. Nevertheless, to our surprise, our recommendations were accepted in whole by the legislature. But that was just the beginning, and I'll come back to that situation in a bit. Historically, if you go back to colonial times, most children were educated at home. There were public schools, but they were public only in the sense that anyone could attend them so long as they could afford the tuition, which was not cheap. The public schools as we know them today did not really come into being until the mid-1800s. 1852, Massachusetts became the first state to adopt a compulsory attendance law, or truancy law, which required all children between the ages of 8 and 14 to be enrolled in school. But by 1918, every state had adopted a truancy law. Homeschooling was illegal until the late 1970s. But then things began to change rapidly. Within 20 years, by the late 1990s, homeschooling was legal in every state. Today, approximately 2 to 3% of school-aged children are homeschooled. It amounts to about 2 million kids. these children are subject to regulations which I'll discuss in a little more detail. But the trend in homeschooling, although it went up greatly during the pandemic to about 11%, has come down dramatically. But the trend is toward rapid expansion of homeschooling in this country. Now, if you compare us to other countries around the world, we've taken a more lax approach to regulating homeschooling. Many countries require, if there's going to be homeschooling, that there be regular visitations of the home and that the children be tested. Some countries, like Germany, ban homeschooling altogether. There was a challenge to that ban in Germany, and the case went up to Germany's Federal Constitutional Court. That court upheld the ban on homeschooling, saying in part that Germany had a significant interest in preventing parallel societies with different philosophical convictions from taking root in the country. The court noted that Germany had an interest in integrating immigrants to society. They also said that it was important for children to be exposed to others who have different beliefs and cultures. Back in the United States, when North Dakota's legislature adopted our recommendations, there were several guardrails put in place in that legislation. The first of which was, if you wanted to homeschool, you had to file a sworn affidavit saying that your children's attendance at a public school violated your sincerely held religious beliefs. That was guardrail number one. There were others. The teaching parent had to have, at a minimum, a bachelor's degree from an accredited college. The parent had to assure the state that the children who were being homeschooled were vaccinated in the same way and for the same diseases as public school children. The parent had to use a curriculum which paralleled that in the public schools, had to cover the same topics as those in the public schools. There would be annual testing, and if a child's test scores fell below the state averages, a remediation plan supervised by public school personnel would be put in place. There would be home visits every semester to see that the home was an adequate place for education and that children with disabilities were being adequately cared for and receiving adequate help with their disability. In every succeeding legislative session after that first one, these guardrails were lowered or eliminated. Today, in North Dakota, if you want to homeschool your child, you have to file a statement with the county superintendent of schools giving the names and ages of the children. That's it. That's it. There is a requirement that those children be tested every year. However, the legislature said that any parent who objects to testing for philosophical, moral, or religious reasons may opt out. In effect, there is no testing requirement in North Dakota. There are 12 states in this country which do not even require that a child be registered as being homeschooled. There are 10 states, only 10 out of 50, that require that the teaching parent have some sort of qualification, him or herself. But even in those 10 states, the most that is asked is that the parent have a high school diploma. Now let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of homeschooling. First, from the parent's perspective. The number one reason that most parents homeschool is for religious reasons. It's estimated that anywhere from 55 to 90% of parents who homeschool do it for religious reasons. There are no woke teachers in the homeschool. There's no indoctrination on the part of the teacher. Kids can be taught the way the parents want to teach them. For fundamentalist Christians, teaching about secularism or feminism runs against and violates their religious beliefs. And so, take the children out of school, homeschool them, do it the way you want to. In 20 states, if you homeschool, there is no vaccination requirement. And even in those states which require vaccination, there's no enforcement mechanism. You don't have to provide proof of anything. And they're not going to come to your home to check and see whether your kids have been vaccinated. There are no Columbines, there are no Sandy Hooks in a homeschool. Now, if you compare that to the public schools, since the year 2000, more than 300 children have been slaughtered in school. There's less pressure on homeschooled children to engage in premarital sex or to use drugs or alcohol or other drugs. Homeschooling allows you to spend more time with your children. Oh, that's a double-edged sword. For those of you who are parents. And most homeschooling parents will tell you that the education that their children receive at home is superior to that they would receive in the public schools. This, of course, is disputed. Now let's look at some of the disadvantages from the parent's perspective. First, there are approximately half of the states that will make the public school curriculum available for free to the homeschool community. In other states, there are free access to textbooks, to lesson plans, other educational activities made available to homeschooled kids. But if a parent doesn't like the textbook being used in the public school, and many of them don't, or they don't like the lesson plans, then they have to buy their own, and that costs money. Another disadvantage is that homeschooling involves some work. On average, homeschool parents spend 2 to 4 hours a day teaching children. Socialization. Homeschoolers recognize that this is an issue, and so they will often collaborate with other homeschool students and go on field trips together, but that involves travel and expense. Another disadvantage from the parent's perspective, in 11 states, there is a required home visitation, and parents view that as being intrusive. And finally, extracurricular activities. 35 states allow homeschool kids to participate in any public school activity they want. But there are 15 states that do not. And so in those 15 states, parents obviously view that as a disadvantage of homeschooling. Oh, one more. Some parents realize that they're not adequately equipped to teach certain subjects. So they have to hire a tutor to educate their children. And again, that costs money. I came across a few statements that I thought were kind of interesting. These are from homeschool students who later attended public schools. One of them said, "I was shocked to learn you needed permission to talk or go to the bathroom." Another, "Lectures where you sit and learn are boring. I was surprised to see girls wore high heels and lots of makeup. I didn't know how to play games in Phi-Ed classes." Another student, "The concept of studying was foreign to me. At home, I was never tested. College was difficult for me. There were so many people. It was so loud, bright, and smelly. Nothing prepared my immune system for the cesspool of germs in a high school. Students were herded like cattle from one class to another. Pop culture references everybody else knew were foreign to me. Now let's look at some of the advantages of homeschooling from a society's perspective. One study done in 2006 found that the more someone was educated at home, the less cynical they became. Another study done in 2014 of 300 college students found that homeschooled students were more politically tolerant than kids who went to the public or private schools. Risky behavior. Homeschool students are less likely to engage in risky behavior later on in life than public school students. Another study showed that homeschool students are more likely to engage in volunteer activities than public school students. This is disputed. Still, another study found that homeschooled children are significantly less likely to suffer from depression than students who go to public or private schools. And homeschooled students do better in college than students who went to public or private schools. Again, this is disputed. Now, when I say disputed, why? Elizabeth Bartholet is a law school professor at Harvard, and she recently wrote a law review article about homeschool research. She found that leaders in the homeschool movement strongly discourage parents, homeschool parents, from participating in any study unless it is sponsored by one of the homeschool advocacy groups. The studies that Professor Bartholet looked at that were conducted by these advocacy groups, she said, only used a tiny subset of the whole homeschool student body. And their success was measured by tests administered by their parents. So it's somewhat questionable how valid the research is. Professor Bartholet said, we don't know what percentage of homeschool students are tested. We don't know what percentage of, or what those test results are. We don't know what percentage of those high school students who are homeschooled go to college. We don't know what percentage of those people graduate from college. In short, we don't know, according to former President George W. Bush, is our children learning? Now let's look at some of the disadvantages from a society's perspective. Many homeschooled parents are not qualified to teach everything that must be taught. They lack, many of them, lack enough formal education themselves to take on advanced topics or complex subjects, and in those cases, I'm not certain what the children are learning. In 1/4 of all homeschooled households, the teaching parent has, at most, a high school diploma. In 11% of homeschooled families, no one speaks English. Many of these homeschooled parents are incapable of diagnosing, much less providing adequate services to children who have disabilities. The curriculum. The curriculum used in homeschools varies, of course, but the most popular one in the world is something that has been promulgated by ACE, Accelerated Christian Education. This company was founded in the 1970s. The people who wrote the curriculum are Christians who believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible. Accelerated Christian Education curriculum is used in more than 6,000 schools in 145 countries around the world. Parents like it because it doesn't actually require them to teach. Instead, they use notebooks, up to 70 of them, 70, in 1 year. These notebooks contain worksheets with fill-in-the-blank questions, the answers a couple pages away. Critics of this curriculum say that it emphasizes rote memorization rather than the development of analytical skills. And because it follows a literal interpretation of the Bible, if you're reading the ACE curriculum, you'll find that slaves who knew Jesus Christ were better off than free people who did not know Christ. You will also learn in the Accelerated Christian Education curriculum that man and dinosaur walked the earth at the same time. I was amused a little while back when I realized that if you take a literal interpretation of the Bible, there are so many offenses for which death is the appropriate penalty. Working on the Sabbath, cursing your parents, adultery, and more. So I'm reading this book a couple of years ago, and the author tried for 1 year to follow the strict edicts of the Bible to the letter. Well, he would go to Central Park in New York City and play chess with a friend I'll call Bob. In playing chess with Bob, he learns that Bob is married, but he's engaged in an affair with another woman. Now, what's AJ to do? The Bible says you have to stone him. So he resolved the matter by picking up a few pebbles and tossing them at Bob. Socialization. There are many psychologists who believe that children who are homeschooled become too dependent on their parents, and that homeschooling automatically delays their personality development. These children are not being exposed to others who have diverse ideas, thoughts, cultures. But, as this meme points out, I don't know if you can read the bottom, you don't think my kids fit in with the rest of society? That was kind of the point. Not exposing your children, if you're a homeschooler, not exposing your children to the diverse cultures and beliefs, that's exactly what these parents want. In the public schools, teachers, guidance counselors, principals, school nurses are all mandatory reporters. That means that if they reasonably suspect that a child has been maltreated, they are duty-bound by law to report that to authorities. Some parents, when they realize or figure out that they are being suspected of child abuse or neglect, pull their kids out of school. There was a study done, an unrepresentative sample of 3,700 former homeschool students. And that study showed that 40% of those students reported being abused or neglected at home. Some parents refuse or don't want to have their children in a public school to avoid the vaccination requirements. And there is no state in this country which requires a background check on homeschooling parents. Now, when I was the assistant middle school golf instructor, I had to be fingerprinted and I had to have a criminal record check done before I could get within 10 feet of a kid. Homeschool graduates, according to this study, have lower income as young adults than public school students, have lower levels of civic engagement, have a higher sense of helplessness with dealing with issues that come up every day, and have higher divorce rates. Extremism. Many parents homeschool in order to promote racist ideologies or to prevent racial intermingling. Derek Black is a young leader of the white nationalist movement. He was pulled out of school in order to avoid him having contact with Haitians and Hispanics in the West Palm Beach school system. Part of his homeschool education was developing a website for Stormfront. Stormfront is the largest racist community on the internet. Logan and Katja Lawrence operate a neo-Nazi homeschool network with thousands of members. They're quite proud of their curriculum, which they say should help raise a new generation of wonderful Nazis. The right of a child to an education sometimes clashes with the right of a parent to raise his or her child. Today in this country, there's no federal constitutional right to an education. The states control, for the most part, how children are educated. Legalizing homeschooling was an attempt to balance those interests. Did it succeed? That, my friends, I leave to you. And I thank you for your kind attention.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a great overview. I appreciate it. Before we start the question and answer session, there is a dropped set of cards in the name of Russell Orm.
Right there. There's Russell.
Thank you. I know exactly what that is.
Good. All right. Homeschooling was before my time, but there were any number of my peers in the grades that I attended that would have wished that I had engaged in homeschooling. On the other hand, whatever paltry socialization skills I have are almost due entirely to not being homeschooled. Questions?
Hi. Can you comment on the movement to eliminate the Department of Education?
You know, I'm not that well versed in the pros and cons of that movement. I mean, my initial reaction is that it's a mistake because I'm sort of Jeffersonian in my beliefs that the only way that this democracy is going to survive is if people are well educated. And I'll acknowledge there's probably all kinds of bureaucratic issues with the Department of Education, but eliminating it doesn't sound to me like the way to go about fixing things. My opinion, I honestly don't know that much about pros and cons of doing away with it.
Just to interject, one of the things that a lot of folks don't recognize is that all of the regulations regarding special needs children and their education are promulgated and enforced by the Department of Education.
Good point.
As you mentioned that the compulsory education was enacted in a period of about 70 years, which is pretty quick. There must have been, I'm assuming, some problems with people not sending their kids to school. I would guess it might be child labor, like on the farm or in the factory, or just ignorance or other reasons. Maybe you could explain, because I run into conservatives now who want to do away with Department of Education or public schools, And I'm thinking, well, they're probably not aware of what the problems were when you didn't have such things.
You made the exact point that I was thinking of as you started your question. The statutes requiring compulsory attendance came through the legislatures at exactly the same time as the movement was to ameliorate child labor. So there were child labor laws and truancy laws that were passed by legislatures at the same time. You know, and getting back to Massachusetts, I had that, they were the first state to pass the compulsory attendance law. The legislators in debating that issue said that it was important to integrate immigrants and to give poor children an opportunity to rise above the circumstances of their birth. Well, seems to me that those same values were the ones that the German Federal Constitutional Court mentioned, and that I'm sure other states have mentioned as well in passing their laws. So yes, I think that child labor movement, that was arising at the same time as the truancy laws. Get them out of the factories and get them into school.
You didn't mention the poor state of schools in some districts as an issue driving homeschooling. Do you not see that as a reason why some parents homeschool? I mean, we have districts like in Baltimore, for example, where you read articles where like 5% of the high school graduates can read at, you know, an appropriate level. Is that not one of the factors that drive parents to homeschool?
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
So I have 3 granddaughters in California who are all homeschooled. And it's a little different system. They get money. It's through Blue Ridge Academy, which is an accredited program through California State. And each of the children, the 6-year-old, 10-year-old, and the 12-year-old, get public school money. There are accredited classes. They are tested constantly, and they also meet with a monthly advisor. My biggest concern as an educator myself, of course, is the socialization and long-term issues for my kids, my grandkids. So there's no long-term studies about homeschooling and what happens to these kids. You know, like, I don't know what's going to happen once they're in the world. And by the way, my kids say that they're going to go all the way through high school by homeschooling as well.
Why?
So, well, there are various reasons. I'm glad you brought that up. One is the religious reason. They are Christians. Number 2 is they really object to the violence in Los Angeles public schools. They feel their kids are not safe. You know, and they don't like the fact that there are 33 kids in a class. We have a lot of kids in our classrooms, but, you know, things are different, whatever. So they feel they're getting a really good education. And they have a lot of cousins and all, but I still feel that they're not getting the opportunities that they might get in a public school education. So that's how my kids feel.
Thank you for that. I had one other thought. When I went back to your question about bad schools and as a motivation. In North Dakota, we have, I think we still have, one of the best educational systems in the country. And it's not just opinion, because it's backed up by test scores that have been done for decades. Small schools, mostly homogeneous. There aren't many minorities in North Dakota, quite frankly. But I think the percentage of kids who are homeschooled there parallels the Marylands or the Californians. So, although I'm sure it is a factor, it has to be a factor, I'm not seeing that as being the sole reason for the increase in the percentage of kids who are being homeschooled. I think there's more to it than that.
I have a question about charter schools and religious charter schools. In the state of Wisconsin, there's a push to have public school funds go to these religious charter schools. And again, the testing is very shady. I don't know if they have to have any testing. But I'm wondering if this is like an end around with
from homeschooling to send your kids to these religious charter schools, and they're taking taxpayer dollars from the public schools, which are definitely suffering because of it. I don't know what's happening nationwide, but in Wisconsin, there's a movement to do that.
You know, there may be somebody who's more knowledgeable about Florida law than I am, but my cursory research showed that if you want to have a private school, even a homeschool, I believe, qualifies, you can get a grant from the state of Florida. Now, they get around publicly funding these schools and homeschools by allowing corporations to donate money to use for these grants. And the corporations which donate this money get a tax credit, not a tax deduction, a tax credit for doing that. So indirectly, it's tax money that Florida residents should be getting from those corporations, but it's going into the hands of the people who are homeschooling or running their. Now, again, I didn't do that much research on the topic because I started going down a rabbit hole and I thought, I'm never going to get out of here. That's another presentation.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I didn't know what to expect, but you validated some of the experiences I have had. My wife and I had a restaurant or a coffee shop in rural Iowa, about 25 miles out of Des Moines, so it was close to the city. And it's like 1999, there wasn't even a Starbucks in the town, or in the state. We hired a lot of homeschool children, our teenagers, I guess 13, they could start working, and they always were on time, they were polite, they were very well behaved, they were pretty good workers, but there were some problems, and the problems were, 17-year-old on the application spelled school, S-K-O-L-A, and I still remember that. Now, we still used money back then, but none of them could count change. And one young lady was 17, I thought she seemed quite well off, intelligent, but she told me that her mother, she went home and she taught her 7 younger siblings. She was the teacher for the class. And the results, I don't know any of them went to college. I think Beth, this 17-year-old, may have gone and finished. But the twins, it started when they were 13. At 18, one of them went and got tattoos all over her body. He's been struggling ever since. I don't know. One girl got married when she was 18, is doing well, studying with 5 children, but none of them could count, do math. Their spelling was terrible. And one of the mothers came in and had lunch and was telling me how excited she was because she was teaching her child about the Civil War and some basic premises that were pretty, like Gettysburg was a battle in the Civil War, and that she was learning more than the children were. So that's my experience. So it's anecdotal, but it's my experience.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very good. I have 2 kind of quick questions, but I'll ask them separately. The first question is, of the 35 states that allow extracurricular activities to take place in a public school setting if the kid is at homeschooling, do you know if any of those states allow a public charter school to be the place where the extracurricular activity can take place? Or is it strictly in a public school setting?
Public schools.
Not a public charter school that's taxpayer funded. I know that's a kind of a esoteric question, but I was curious.
I'm unsure of the answer, to be honest with you, because I'm not that familiar with the practices of the charter schools.
Fair enough. And secondly, have you ever seen any studies or research or articles of those parents, I guess relatively few, whose motivation for starting public schooling with their kids has nothing to do with religion? What is their motivation, aside from violence in the Los Angeles school system, or as an example, which was just mentioned? Is there study, or is religion really the basis for why public school, homeschooling gets started?
I harken back to the one study I read that said 55 to 90% of parents homeschool, and their primary reason, not their sole reason, but their primary reason was religious.
Thanks, Jim. My question was exactly about that statistic, or statistic. 50 to 90% is a pretty wide gap. I mean, that's pretty fluffy, as an understatement. Where did they get 50 to 90%?
That's a good question, Jim, and I don't know, off the top of my head who did the research. I just know that from reading Bartholet's law review article that it's extremely difficult to get homeschooling parents to cooperate with any kind of a study. And I don't know that that extends to their kids once they get out of high school. That unrepresentative sample of 3,700 homeschool students, I don't know why it's unrepresentative. The one that said that 40% reported abuse or neglect as children being raised. I'm not exactly sure about all the specifics.
It leaves me wondering just what that means. If 50 to 90% weren't sure why they were homeschooling, or 50 to 90% were doing it for religious reasons, but they may not have a religion that they're attached to, or it's just almost a meaningless statistic.
Well, at least half. So it's saying at least half are doing it for primarily religious reasons.
Thank you.
I just want to mention one motivation we haven't talked about is special needs. And even in my old school district in Boulder, Colorado, fabulous school district, kids with special needs, a lot of them were completely falling between the cracks. So I decided to homeschool. I wasn't going to be the teacher. I had a highly qualified special ed teacher to tutor my son. When I went in, though, in the later 90s, they said, oh yeah, we can certify you or whatever to homeschool, but every few years students are tested. Catch-22, it was coming up in 4 months, and if at that point my son was not at grade level, I was considered to have let them down. I said, you had 10 years to bring him to grade level, and I'm the one who let him down? So that didn't work. I went home, read all the material. I like find ways around things, and I don't tend to like authority. And so the next day I walked in, sat down with the same woman and said, okay, I'm opening a private school. Enrollment of 1, location will be at my home. No requirements, open to private school to tutor my son.
And there were no inspectors coming to look at your school?
Not at all.
I gave a talk on a very similar subject a number of years ago, concentrating on Florida and Texas and California, and looking at the textbooks and looking at homeschooling and so on. And it is appalling when you look at some of the materials that the kids in these private and parochial schools and homeschools are given to the kids to study from. The one picture that's burned into my brain shows a man, Homo sapien man, wearing a fur thing, attacking a dinosaur. These are only 55 million years apart, but this is 65. This is what the kids are learning in the schools. The other problem is that these schools are taking huge amounts of money away from the public school. The public schools are really suffering because so much money is being siphoned off for charter schools and home schools, where one child gets the same amount of money that 4 or 5 kids would get in the public schools. And if you want to destroy public education, this is the way to do it. Just keep opening private and charter schools.
Thank you.
I think it was a very excellent talk. One other motivation, though, that I didn't really get discussed is, the religious thing, understandably, there are extremes and everything, but how about objection to the woke indoctrination that's occurring in so many public schools? I mean, that would be reason enough to homeschool, in my opinion.
I'm sorry, which kind of indoctrination?
Woke indoctrination.
What do you mean by that?
Woke? Basically far left concepts that including not daring to disagree with the accepted speech, and they'll ruin you if you say the wrong thing, and you have to conform. They don't teach how to think; they teach what to think, and that's what I'm referring to.
Oh, where does that happen?
Where does it happen?
Yeah.
In public schools, especially in blue states, but even in some of the other states.
That's new to me.
I appreciate your dissertation. I think it kind of started off with leaning towards bias of traditional schools. And so I was looking at, because my daughter's homeschooled, and I've been tutoring her in math for the past, granddaughter, tutoring her in math for the past 5 years in the Florida system. A lot of inadequacies I see, but some of the data, I just want to question. College graduation rates, 67% homeschool, 59% traditional school. High school graduation rates, 91% homeschool, 67% traditional. Test performances, higher at homeschool. Pretty much all of the metrics point towards higher, more success from homeschoolers, both in high school as well as into college. I'm not sure if this data is accurate, and we can question data because I'm not sure your data is accurate. But there's a flip side to each point, and I don't think it's all about religion either. All right, I feel that is what the group is sensing. For my granddaughter, it was not. So I just wanted to make those comments.
Thank you.
I guess my feedback's similar to what a couple of people are saying. I think your characterization, you've done a really good job of talking about the pros and cons, but the conclusion that I think a lot of people would get is that the homeschooling is by fundamentalist Christians and neo-Nazis, and the experience within my family unit is a little different from that. My daughter is probably the most influential person in this country when it comes to encouraging alternative means of education. The reason I bring that up, not as a proud parent, but I want to look at who the people are that are looking at homeschooling. You're talking about an extremist element there. My daughter is looking at alternative approaches which takes homeschooling and integrates it to address the issues you talked about. The 35 states They can use, go to the public schools to get extracurricular activities. They also get groupings of homeschool students, so they're not limited. Can you hear me? Okay. To interrelate to other kids their age, and so they will get together in large warehouses where they will have teachers that know what they're talking about in special situations talk about it. Now, who is asking for this? She was requested to come and meet with the NFL Players Association, which is primarily black, and those kids, these kids are required. Are the pro football players? They're coming out. A lot of them are coming out of the ghetto, and they see the public schools failing in the ghetto, and they want to see these alternative means. Who is pushing my daughter? Because my daughter doesn't have any money behind her. She's a joint venture for two multi-billionaire groups. On the far left, the Walton family, and on the far right, the Koch family at Wichita. And they're together. So you've got both extremes that want to do that. I know you want to cut me off. Thank you.
Well,
The humanists don't like that.
2 minutes per person.
Oh, I'm sorry. I haven't heard that.
I want to acknowledge that the percentage of homeschooling parents who are in the neo-Nazi network, even if it's in the thousands, is just a tiny percentage of the 2 million kids who are being homeschooled. And make no mistake, I'm not alleging that that's ubiquitous in the homeschool movement. But the thought occurs to me that if you were a parent and in the public school learned that a teacher was essentially using a curriculum that would promote neo-Nazism, I think something would be done in that community. I think there would be hell to pay. I think people would go to the school board. They'd say, what's going on? Why is this teacher allowed to do this? And I think it would be stopped. But as I think I've pointed out, if you want to homeschool, what you teach, how you teach, or if you teach, is almost entirely left up to the parent.
Okay, first of all, I enjoyed in the show when it said that the homeschool kids said they wouldn't even let me go to the bathroom unless I raised my hand or whatever. Because I remember when I was a child, I was raising my hand, they wouldn't let me go to the bathroom. And I peed myself and started crying, and then they told me to go to the bathroom and don't come back. And I think a year later, okay, we went to a new school. Okay. But anyway, that was my family. We had gone to a different school because of the abuse of those teachers in the school where I was forced to wet my pants. Second of all, I've heard that Florida has a large number of families that live on boats and go traveling around in their boats and stuff and homeschool other kids on their boats. Okay, I thought that's an interesting aspect of it. It's actually something that has a constitutional aspect in Florida. Another thing I wanted to mention was if you've ever been to Sioux Falls, you've seen atheist billboards decrying Christian indoctrination and calling it childhood mental mutilation, okay, which I thought was interesting. So I went to their website and then they spammed the hell out of me. But I know they didn't want money and they didn't really have anything new to say. They just kept saying the same thing over and over again. So that's about it.
Yeah.
I was born in North Dakota, not far from Mont. I went to public education for, several years. I'm a teacher, 43 years in a public school in 2 different states. I think it's important that the discussion be had. But in education, and having taught 43 years and loved parents, they are the #1 issue. Because every parent thinks they know what the solution is because they've all been educated in school. I think it's important to keep an open mind. Why did we have a problem to start with? It started, as you said, in the 70s. That's when I started teaching. It started in actually probably 1962 when the Supreme Court decided prayer was no longer allowed in school. I taught earth science, I taught the Genesis, etc. That was a tough topic to teach in a public school because you weren't allowed to bring in all concepts, meaning religion. Is creation one of those theories? Yes, it's no different than evolution. The day I taught it, I went to the library. I had a student go get the most popular, oldest book in the library, the Bible. I figured I'd be in front of the school board in a week. I wasn't. Because there are theories, and they all need to be taught, and that's the importance of public education. What happened, I think, and I saw it over 4 decades in education, was the power of the teacher was taken away. We became the middle person. Now, there were teachers that needed to be gotten rid of, but I don't think teachers ever, as a union, policed their own people. So that became part of the problem. This gentleman spoke about woke. Let me tell you, in the last 5 years I taught, we were asked to put a rainbow flag on our door to show that gays were okay in our room. I objected, because gays were okay in my room, but I didn't need to put up a gay flag to do that, because bullying was not allowed in any sense, not just gays. The next problem, and I just want to bring a few of these things up, just a couple more statements and I'll be quiet because it's not my talk, but let's take, for example, special education. My favorite students were autistic kids, but you had to have special care because what special ed parents wanted was their kids to be taught the same as all kids. So they started putting them in the regular classroom. Then the bright student in my class got less of an education because now we had to educate to the bottom. So let's divide kids. That became a problem. I don't have answers to any of these problems, but I can tell you that there were a lot of problems, and that started what you're seeing as homeschooling. We have 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls. Our oldest son was in the Navy Academy, 26 years in the military, and he homeschooled his kids. I was his teacher in high school. I could talk for a long time about, I appreciate everybody's comments, but as an educator, I think it's important, one thing, no matter what you hear today, keep an open mind.
Thank you. You're here. We endorse that last entirely.
Yes, I've been trying to assess the significance of this at a societal level and over time, and I'm thinking the argument of homeschool or public school or whatever is arguable on both sides, and the worst case seems to be a small group of homeschooled kids would have a suboptimal start in life from one perspective, and then the second degree is a little more serious, and it is a vehicle to enforce Christian nationalism, which would impose arbitrary dogma on people like us who don't want it. So that has a little more harm, but and that is a little more likely. So that aspect is problematic. And also a more less informed public that don't know about science and so forth. The third level would be about the racism and Nazism and so forth, which I think is minor, like you said, and I'm not, though it's very dangerous, I'm not really concerned it's a viable danger now in our country at that level. The fourth one, though, would be things like Islamicist schools who are teaching terrorism and the Sharia law and so forth, which to me is a very, very dangerous thing because they have taken over a number of countries. They're a long, long way from taking over America. But Germany is more at risk, and that was reflected in their statement and so forth. So that's my assessment, and maybe your comment on that.
Any comments?
I think there's a gentleman there.
Hand up for ages.
just as a retired scientist, one of the things that comes up in this, and not just in social, but certainly in social sciences, is look at who's providing the funding for the survey. Okay? If Cheetos is doing a nutrition study, they're probably going to say they're good for you.
Education, to me, has always been the beginning of anything that is human, and of course it applies to humanism as well. Why do we need an education? What is happening today, if you look in society, you find that it's such a change that are taking place, whether they're physical or spiritual, that kind of say to the education we've been discussing as a historical novel, which will be obsolete in a very short period of time. And we need to be prepared to understand what is happening in our society in order to be able to educate whoever needs to be educated to function in our society compatible with what is happening today.
Thank you.
Don't be impatient, I'm moving as fast as I can.
Hi, I'm a retired special ed teacher from Michigan. My last years were in high school. And we started out as having separate classrooms, and we went to co-teaching. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. I think you need all approaches. I'm sure there are some parents who are homeschooling who are doing a wonderful job, some who aren't. Some public schools are wonderful, some aren't. You know, so it's not a one-size-fits-all. You have to go with what's good for the kid. And, you know, I mean, some of us are luckier. I was in a fairly good, high school in Michigan that was funded, and the parents were involved. And that kind of
I'm married to an excellent teacher, and she taught family and consumer sciences, what used to be called home ec. And she taught foods classes, she taught child development, she taught what I thought people needed to do to succeed in life. Well, in the public school system, it seemed like more often than not, if you had a child with disabilities, they ended up in Pam's class. And if you've got 25 kids, and that one child necessitates a lot of time, it doesn't necessarily rob other children of time. My thought was, all the money that we spend on a variety of other things in this country might better be spent on schools so that your class sizes were 8 or 10, not 25, not 30. But we don't seem willing to do that, because at least in North Dakota, the schools are supported by property taxes. And so many people, once their kids are raised and gone, if they have kids, say, not my job. I'm not paying for that anymore. And they vote down any increase in the school mill levy. It's an issue.
I worked and taught in the Chicago public school system, and I have more or less seen both ends of the homeschooling issue. In the city of Chicago, there is a group of highly educated, very, very successful people who have band together in homeschooling groups. And all of the museums in the city of Chicago offer special programs that they can access their services during the day. And I mean, they're fantastic. They cannot be beat. The child that is in these programs is a lucky child. Then on the other side, the city of Chicago at least used to have a significant gypsy population. And let me assure you, the gypsies pull their kids out of school the moment there is a problem and say, we're homeschooling them.
Interesting.
kids, and the teachers are getting rewarded when the test scores, they design a test, and I don't know how many teachers are spending all of their time worrying about whether their score is going to be at a certain level. And the focus needs to be on love of learning, having a question and wanting to get an answer for it, or reading a book and wanting to figure out in your own mind, what would you do in that situation? There's very little time in a classroom for that type of exploration.
Thank you.
I think the gentleman over there sort of got across that parents are almost wanting too much inclusion in trying and deciding what their kids should be taught or not taught or whatever. I taught for 34 years, but I taught those 34 years in Catholic school. and so we were our own collective bargaining unit. We could make a few more of our own rules. And when I went outside of the curriculum to teach, for example, consumer math, where the kids were actually learning how to do checkbooks and so on, and if I was going to teach decimals, I'm going to give them a reason to have to use decimals. But you know, parents would come in and go, "What a sum? You're not teaching from the book. You're not teaching the curriculum," and they would just make all sorts of problems that way. The other thing I think is a big issue and a whole other thing that could be another talk is grading. Parents were so concerned that their kids were getting A's. And the kids were that way. They said, "Well, you know, Miss Francis, my parents want me to get an A. A C is no good." And I would have to get that across to parents. The teachers are being forced, in a way, with the pressure from parents, to actually give the kids A's and B's so they don't have to, they don't have to deal with parents. For example, I had a next door teacher, when we were going into computers and you saw everybody's grades, you were able to do that. I had a teacher next door who was teaching my singing subjects in the area of language arts. 20 out of 25 students were getting straight A's in the 3 language arts courses that I was teaching, whereas I was getting some flack because some of my kids were getting C's or B's. But then we had to question who had the better content, who was not dealing with that pressure, ignoring it, and saying, "I'm going to teach these kids what they need to be taught and give them the love of learning in addition to that." I was actually told by a parent once, "Why are you asking our kids to look up some of these things in the encyclopedia or whatever? That's not part of the curriculum. That just seems like wasted time." And the kids loved it. They were given these little things, these little, not assignments, I gave them bonus points that we call them. I didn't grade them. And they'd come back so excited. And then you get the parent that comes in and goes, "Why are you wasting my kids' time or having them come home and make me have to help them do this?" So.
Well, I think there may be some very good or few good homeschoolers, but that's okay. But I resent my taxpayer dollar, my money, going into anything but a public school system, because why should my money be divided between private schools and etc., or homeschooling? But if you want to homeschool, then that could be supplied by anyone who wants to donate their money to.
Well, we're about out of time, or our allotted time, so.
One more person.
What? All right. Well, all right.
John Chunichuk, I'm a lifelong meteorologist. I'm still active, retired from the Air Force, but I'm still a certified consultant meteorologist. And through the American Meteorological Society, they asked me to mentor students in college. And I'm finding that most of those coming out of the high schools think we have a climate crisis. There's a problem in our public schools, maybe even in the private schools. There's no crisis, and they're amazed to find out after we tell them what the data really says that it's really not a problem. So there may be less need for homeschooling if we can correct some of the curriculum in the schools, especially when it comes to climate change. Storms are decreasing, polar bears are not a problem, corals are not a problem. Yeah, I run the weather club, and I go over this data all the time. So if anybody's interested, just come see me.
Good point.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks all. And Jim, thank you so much for a great